We're moving into a time of year which I think will gradually be known as the Mahasamadhi season, like the Christmas season or something, because we have Yogananda's passing is March 7th, Sri Yukteswar, his guru's passing is March 9th. Easter always comes sometime around in here, about the 27th of March. And then on April 21st, that's the day that Swami Kriyananda left his body. So, is this the celebration of death sort of time? The death festival? I know that sounds morbid to most Western ears because of the way we think about life. But really, there's nothing morbid at all about it. When someone graduates from high school and goes on to college, graduates from college and goes into graduate school, gets their PhD and goes into their career, we never consider any of these transitions a tragedy because they suit our concept of what we're supposed to be doing. But when we graduate completely from the whole experience of having gotten this body in the first place and used it up, somehow we consider that somehow that's a failure of some sort. I received an absolutely chilling email from friends in New York who are helping a woman who's part of the Ananda group there in what is really the last stages of her life. But they haven't really gotten mastery of the situation sufficiently, so they're still desperately treating this woman. Even though there's no hope, and even no hope of really making her better, and even if they did make her better, there's nothing left. The body's done. When our friend Happy Winningham, who was a member of Ananda for many years, she was an early recipient of the AIDS virus. And she went through the whole cycle of AIDS long before most other people did. And she was very valiantly trying to stay in her body for quite a long time, which she did. And she said it was like having a bad case of the flu all the time. So it was a bit of a struggle. So she was only in her 40s, I believe, when she passed. And she went to Swami Kriyananda and said, how much is enough? Because she'd already had 2 or 3 experiences of going all the way to the edge of leaving her body and going into the astral world and seeing how really gorgeous the whole experience was. And so she didn't have any fear of letting go of her body. She just wanted to do the right thing. So she asked Swami Kriyananda, how long do I struggle? When can I just say enough already? And his answer was very interesting. He said, first of all, it's great good karma to get a human body. We're all in the astral world and we have karma to work out and we have to come to the material plane, and we've gone through many, many incarnations. That little spark of our own divinity has evolved through all the animal levels. That's what the masters tell us. And then finally we warrant a human body and we have the opportunity to use it well. And then of course we use it badly for a really, really long time. The little bird, having so much fun flying on its own, thought, let me just gather for myself. And even though this didn't work very well, we work at it for a really long time. So by the time you know what the purpose of life is, you have yourself a guru, you have a spiritual practice, a spiritual family, it's not something to lightly toss away for, what happens next. You get born in those little baby bodies, and you're pooping into the diaper. I mean, it's just awful altogether. A friend of mine was talking to me about her babies and how they just would get she had twins. She said they'd get so mad at her if she left them in a poopy diaper. They were just so humiliated by the circumstance. Maybe the mother was projecting, but I don't think so. I remember watching a little baby having his diaper changed. He was a very refined child and has become a beautiful, refined adult. He had his head stretched way to the side, as if he was trying to get as far away from the experience as he possibly could. And you can do nothing at that stage. You see parents lovingly carrying their babies around, but the poor babies, and you have to bear in mind, the soul is complete. The body is small and helpless and rather out of control, but the intelligence and the soul consciousness is not diminished. It just doesn't have a vehicle. And some souls just surrender to it and become really, really happy. One of my friends, her son, when he was just refusing to learn to use the potty, the terrific rite of passage for small children, he just wouldn't learn. And she said to him, "Don't you want to be a big boy?" He looked at her in total shock. "No, Mommy, I love being a baby." But most of us don't feel that way. And so when Happy asked Swamiji, "What should I do?" he said, "Well, as long as the body is useful to you spiritually," and that can be specifically interpreted as long as you can do Kriya, as long as you can meditate, but the body can be useful to you spiritually even if you don't have the self-control or the breath to do Kriya. If you can still feel yourself working out karma, facing challenges and turning toward the divine. But at the point at which it becomes such an obstacle that you can't do it anymore, then just let it go. Just let it go. And why not? What is the purpose of living anyway? Daniel Brinkley, who was very involved with hospice and after-death experiences, he said Americans uniquely suffer from what he called life greed. We're greedy for everything in our country. And we're very greedy to keep on living, even though everything is saying, just, my child, let it go. Just let it go. And we face this whole experience actually all the time in our lives because countless experiences are really experiences of death, even if they're not the death of the body. Nothing in this world ever remains. I remember sitting once when I still lived at Ananda Village in what is now the Hansa Temple, used to be the publications building, and I worked up there, and we would often sit on this balcony and have lunch. And from there you could see down the hill to where the main area of the community was. And from that perspective, I watched once a man drive up in his car and get out of his car, and his little daughter, who was about 5, and just, how absolutely adorable little 5-year-old girls can be, especially if they love their daddies. And she saw her father, and loud enough for us to hear hundreds of yards away, screamed at the top of her lungs, "Daddy, Daddy!" dashed across the whole way and just launched herself into his arms with complete confidence that he would catch her, which he did. I'm sitting there thinking, how could we not become attached? How could you not allow yourself, or how challenging it would be not to allow yourself to feed on that? And why should we not? The attitude toward life that says to be spiritual is to be cold and withdrawn and to let nothing touch us is not an attitude that Swami ever endorsed. Swami Kriyananda was talking in a recording I was listening to. He said he was in India and he met a man who was 132 years old. He said, which means he had developed something, some kind of power, some kind of attunement with a reality other than the ordinary one. But his philosophy was, you must never enjoy anything in this life. And Swami said, even a beautiful God-given sunset? Nothing. He said, nothing. And Swami's response was, what a dry way to live. And our path, Master's path, the way Swami lived, was never like that. It was never like, let's be austere by holding ourselves rigidly against the natural flow of things. The path that's been offered to us in many ways is much more difficult. In the Imitation of Christ, it says, keeping complete silence is not difficult. Saying anything, having a completely unbridled tongue is how it was put. That's not difficult either. But restraining yourself appropriately and expressing yourself appropriately, now that's the real challenge. And so, in our life, it would be easier if we could just wall ourselves off somewhere and never be tempted. But instead, Master set up his headquarters in Los Angeles, California. Let's talk about just going right into the lion's den, if you want to say that. And Swami Kriyananda traveled all over the world and just participated in life. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to live appropriately. We're trying to live appropriately with an understanding of who we are, why we were born, and what the purpose of this whole story is. Because sooner or later, and we may think it's going to be later, but when it happens, it's now. That's the great, charming reality of time, isn't it? It's always in the future until it isn't. And then it's suddenly in the past. And most of us are not really living in this part of it. We're living in where it's going to go and where it's already been. But when that moment comes, when this body is finished and it begins to turn itself toward closing itself down instead of opening itself up, where are we in relation to that? Are we panic-stricken? Are we falsely eager to escape, imagining that merely shedding the body will actually free us from that which ails us? No such luck there either. Life is a whole series of challenges for us. Whether we're suffering or not suffering, the challenge is always the same. What am I experiencing? What do I think is real? Where is my happiness coming from? Yes, it would be cruel, really, for that father not to open his arms and accept that child's love. Once that child comes into his life, whether he deliberately conceived the child or accidentally, it doesn't matter, that child is there. And now that little girl sees him as her father, and she's a stand-in for Divine Father. She's teaching that child about love. A friend of mine was told by an astrologer that the most auspicious period of his life was his first 18 years. And then the astrologer said, too bad, it was wasted. And because it's a time when you're producing nothing, Swami Kriyananda's response was exactly the opposite. He said, what great good karma. He said, because all that auspicious experience right from the beginning just sort of sets you in a direction. It gives you this expectation that I can do it, that it will work out, that life is like this. And we are given children to raise to help them understand that they can trust, that love is real, not self-indulgent love. Master says we should be a little tough with our children. It's a very not a popular philosophy nowadays. But it's an interesting one. He said, don't give them the impression that their desires are there just to be fulfilled. Merely because they want it doesn't mean it ought to be given to them. It's a very fine line to balance, isn't it? Because just on the other side, I'm saying what we want, what we need to be ourselves is we need to be instruments of that divine. But we always need to remember what is really happening here. What is really happening here? Time is such a tricky part of it. And at the stage of life that I'm standing and contemplating being one of those little helpless babies again, which I presume is going to happen to me. God could surprise me, but I don't think so. I think I'll be there again. It's time as a child that confuses us so much. From this perspective, it's so much easier to see. It's so much easier to be patient. It's so much easier to understand, well, if it doesn't work out my way, something else will happen. We've had a few other experiences. But as a little child, when time is so, are we there yet? Are we there yet? I have to wait an hour. An hour is just so enormous. You give a little child 2 minutes of time out. And it's just an eternity for the child, so long. I remember, though, as computers get the way they get, this was when they were just a little slower, and something happened to some man's computer, and he said, I'm going to have to wait a minute till it comes back on again. But it really was this minute. Children have that world. They just think it's all supposed to happen now, and there's no perspective on it. But it's that perspective that really gives us power. It's that keeping our eyes on the real goal. That maybe this is going to be a bad year. Maybe this is going to be a bad month. Maybe it's going to be a bad incarnation. I had to write to this woman once who'd written to me about a marriage that was being arranged for her that she thought wasn't going to work out very well. And I was giving her various pieces of advice as best I could, and I said, And the worst that happens is you'll pay off some karma this incarnation, and the next one will be better. I said, I'm sure that doesn't sound very comforting to you. But from a certain perspective, it does. From a certain perspective, you just realize today is the result of yesterday, and tomorrow is the result of today. So what am I doing? What am I doing now with my consciousness that will make my tomorrow what I want it to be, that will make my final breath what I want it to be, that will make my next step into the astral world just what I want it to be? The more we can, oddly, expand our sense of awareness to infinity and then narrow it back to this moment. Master's instruction, take care of the minutes and the incarnations will take care of themselves. It's fascinating, isn't it? Just take care of the minutes. In our reading today, we have Jesus in his endless arguments with the narrow-minded dogmatists who had the power over the temples at that time. When I went with the group to Israel in October, we went to the Wailing Wall, which is the remnant of the big temple that used to be there. Let me go back first. We went to some museum where somebody had made a scale model of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, which was fascinating to look at, all, tiny little, tremendous labor of love. And the big part of that whole, of all Jerusalem, was this humongous temple, which was, such a point of pride. I'll use the word mistaken pride, that like this huge physical thing was their representation of the power of the religion and their devotion to God. I remember once sitting at Ananda village in my very early years, contemplating higher and lower ages on the planet, the yugas, the Satya Yuga being the highest, the Treta Yuga beneath that, Dwapara Yuga where we are now, and Kali being the bottom of it. Kali is very materialistic, Satya Yuga is very spiritual. And I started realizing that from our perspective, the evidence of Satya Yuga, there won't be any. I was thinking then of the American Indians and how lightly the American Indians could live on Earth. At Ananda Village then, winter was a notable event. It was colder and more snowy at that time. And I think of those pictures you see of the American Indians wrapped in their buffalo blankets and living in their teepees and just going in and being so close to the natural world. I had my tiny little experience of that was having no indoor plumbing, which actually takes you outside at times that you would not have gone outside otherwise. But the extraordinary benefit of that, because I lived in this trailer, which the walls were literally, I think, a quarter inch plywood, maybe 3/4 inch plywood, and it was just nothing. It was just this little tiny spot. So you got outside, and it was just perched in the forest. So you got outside just so quickly. And when you were outside, you were just in the woods. You were nowhere. So there was a much closer relationship. And because the facilities, such as they were outside, you were always stepping out into that world. And I vividly remember being out in the middle of the night in the snow. But not badly. I remember, I can still see it, just looking up like this and watching the snow come out of the night sky. It was thrilling, absolutely thrilling. And I was thinking about the American Indians and how easily they just moved in and out how they moved in the world. I would say in and out. There was no in or out. There was just an everything about it. And I realized, well, of course, the more advanced we are, the less physical barriers we construct. We just can take the world as it is and move through it, being contained within ourselves. The Tibetan Swamiji remarked, hell for the Tibetans is really, really cold. It's not hot, because they can't imagine anything being too warm, but they can't imagine it being way too cold. But the monks have developed the ability to be immune to the cold. And they can literally lie in the snow and melt the snow around them just with the heat they generate from their own bodies. I mean, that's one way of doing it. You just become within yourself everything that you need. And so this idea that this gigantous physical temple with these huge stones is the epitome of religious success, from a certain perspective, is completely wacky. Of course, it was Kali Yuga, and matter was king, and therefore, naturally, everything had to be expressed in a material way. But when I saw first the Wailing Wall, which is here, which is the remnant, it's merely the retaining wall. It's not the temple itself, it's just the retaining wall for the huge thing that was on top of it, which is mostly gone. And then they had excavated down to the paving stones where Jesus were, which took it down about 3 or 4, about another story or two. So I'm standing here against this monstrous heavy thing, and I thought of Jesus coming with this, the lilies of the field. Look to them. Our Father clothes them so perfectly. The birds of the air. I thought, what chance did he have? Just nothing. For his own reasons, for the divine reasons, he was sent to hurl himself against that brick wall of rigidity. But it had nothing to do with God. It was just man imposing on this world all these ideas. This is where, in this very simple exchange, the priests criticized Jesus because your people are not washing their hands properly. But the point I want to make is, let's not miss the point ourselves. Let's not miss the point. The point of our life is really not anything. The point of our life is, guess what, folks? At the end, it all goes away. Everything. Except our consciousness. How much have we loved? How free are we in our hearts? How much of God do we see when we look at each other, when we look at this creation, when we look in the mirror, when we open our mouths? Who are we seeing? Who are we being? What are we doing? Because it doesn't really matter how big the edifice is. The only thing that matters is how much are we instruments of the only thing that really matters. From joy I came, for joy I live, in sacred joy I melt again. Joy, bliss, love, devotion, God. That's all we're here for. God bless you.